recording the session. There we go. And it will be available later through the Core Alberta website. Okay, so today's session is going to be pretty straightforward. We have a presentation today, and then it will be followed with our question and answer period. So we're so excited to have Emily Clough. And I hope I'm saying that right, Emily, am I? Is it Clough? Okay, great.
Yeah, you've got it.
No, is it?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Emily is joining us today from BC, actually, and she's a partner with Clark Wilson LLP. She regularly assists clients with complex estates and trust planning and administration issues, and acts as counsel on estate, trust, and elder law capacity litigation matters. Emily publishes and teaches on estate, trust, and elder law matters, and she was lead counsel in a recent British Columbia case where court set aside an alleged predatory marriage as being invalid. So we're really excited to have Emily with us and to be able to share her experience on this wonderful topic. So Emily, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And I will just arrange to share my screen. And I think I've done that. Let me know if that looks good. It seems like it looks good. Thank you so much. Well, yeah, as Chantal said, she said the wonderful topic of predatory marriages. It's sort of an unfortunate way that we are starting to see, and there's lots of us across Canada and in fact around the world who have a lot of interest in this concept of predatory marriages. And I'll talk about why we have that worry. Why is it such a big concern? But I can tell you, I'm expecting that most of you are in and about Alberta, but this is a bigger problem than that. You'll see of some cases I'll talk about here have occurred across Canada, but there has been interest in this globally as well. There's an article that is being prepared right now, which will eventually be published in The Economist about this issue, and there's some research and reporters looking at this around the world because we see our aging population. We know that it's not just in Canada. We have an aging population. It's the world. We are about to have the biggest transfer of wealth that has ever occurred in history, as our baby boomers will be coming near the end of their lives. So this issue of a predatory marriage where somebody may swoop in there sort of at the last minute and try to take things over is a real risk, and some of us would say a growing risk. So here we go. Let's see. I got to make these keys work. Hang on a second. Here we are. Okay. So what is a predatory marriage? A predatory marriage, we would define it as a marriage to a vulnerable adult, where the intention of that marriage was to secure a share of the vulnerable adult's estates or their assets, really to get at the money of the more vulnerable adult. Why are we seeing these predatory marriages being sort of a problem, if you will? Some of that is to do with the law, and I'll go through some of that more in more detail. But the problem is it's really hard to undo. So in the very simplest of terms, the act of getting married is an extremely easy thing to do. I have looked this up in British Columbia, and you can get yourself married to somebody else and it'll cost you about $150. It takes you about 2 weeks from start to finish, from getting your license to having the wedding ceremony, and you're done. So 2 weeks and $150, and there you are married. Undoing the marriage is an extraordinarily difficult process. Even if we didn't have a predatory situation, if we just had a process where people had been married, they sought to be divorced, that is a complicated process. But the process to have a marriage declared void, that's the word that we would use, so terminated or canceled or over, or the real fancy legal word that we use is void ab initio. And that phrase means it's as if it never happened. It's void right from the start. To have that done can be a complicated, tricky, long, expensive endeavor to go on. So compared to the ease of getting it into a marriage, there's a lot of difficulty in getting out of a marriage. So why would somebody want to predatorily marry somebody else? So this is your law over there in Alberta. So if you are married, so if you have a married spouse, or if, in your words, you're in an adult interdependent partnership, what that means is common law. So you are living together in a marriage-like relationship, although you're not technically married. So we have married people, or you have living together people. If you are those people where you are together and then you break up, the law will say, well, you guys have to deal with your finances. You guys have rights to each other's finances, and there will be some sharing of those finances in what we would call a property division. So whatever assets you have, we've got to look at what's fair and how should those assets be distributed. Does everyone get back their asset? Does this one get more? Does that one get more? What may be it? So number one, there's property division that flows from the act of becoming married, becoming a couple. And the other part is support. So if you were a married couple, or if you were in this adult interdependent relationship and then you break up, there may be spousal support obligations. So obligations for one spouse to pay towards the other some amount of money per month or per year, so that that other spouse can keep on living in their standard of living that they had become accustomed to. So that would be a reason somebody might want to prey on somebody else to become married, so that they know, oh, now we're married. Now, if you ever, somebody figures it out or what have you, and you want to get rid of me and we break up, well, I have a right to property division and I have a right to seek spousal support. It's a very, that's a very strong thing, which will sort of go up. The more money the vulnerable adult has, you can imagine that someone else may look at them with really big eyes to think, aha, even if I just get a little bit of that property division, that would be a significant amount. Just to talk a little bit about this, the phrase Alberta uses is this adult interdependent relationship. Here in BC, we use the word spousal relationship. I'm sure across Canada, everybody uses a different type of a phrase, but what it means is when people are in that marriage-like relationship, even though they're not married. And we see that increasingly, that people are living together in some people call it a domestic partnership in those relationships, but they choose to not get married. So whether somebody is in an adult interdependent relationship, it's sometimes complicated to determine. It's not a checklist, but there are relevant factors that should some judge one day be having to make the decision, oh, are these guys in an adult interdependent relationship? The court might think one of the factors is, do these people have a conjugal relationship? So, we used to think that those conjugal relationships were one of the more core elements of being in a marriage-like relationship or even being in a marriage. And probably that's less important these days. We would look at the degree of exclusivity. So did these people only date or be with each other, or were there other relationships of intimacy that were going on? Part of what comes in there is how people described each other to others. So when they were out at a party, did they say, oh, this is my partner, this is my spouse, this is my boyfriend, girlfriend, this is whoever? Or did they say, oh, that's just my friend, and oh, actually my boyfriend is this person over here? How do people describe that? And did they describe it with some exclusivity? The court could look at the conduct and habits of the people in the household. Where did they live? Did they share a bedroom? Did they do activities like cooking, like relaxing, watching TV? Did they do those together? Sometimes what the court's trying to do there is ferret out what is a spousal, or what is an adult interdependent relationship versus what's a roommate. And we do see that where people will move in and time will tick by, and then people will say, oh yes, I was the spouse. We've been living together for 5 years. Sometimes the families who hear that are quite shocked because they say, no, you lived in the basement. You were the tenant, as a matter of fact, and you paid rent. Well, sometimes it can get pretty murky, because sometimes people will say, well, I did pay rent when I first was there, but I stopped paying rent and our relationship changed, and it was no longer just a tenant or a roommate, and it became this something more, this adult interdependent relationship, such that they can seek that splitting up of property or splitting up of support. Another factor a court would look at in thinking, okay, is this an adult interdependent relationship, is the degree to which they hold themselves out to others. Like, do you say to others, are we a couple? Are we partners? Are we spouses? Whatever the word may be. I think you wouldn't hear too many people saying, oh, that's my adult interdependent person. They probably don't use that, but whatever the description that people would use is fine. But also like the economic interrelationship. It's not required that spouses have an economic relationship in that, you have your accounts together, you split things, you pay for things together. That may have been seen at one point as part of the deal of forming a marriage or a common law relationship. There is that there is financial, that we share things. That's less applicable these days, but it's an important factor that the court will continue to look at, to say, well, did you blend your finances? That's often one of the ones that lets the court try and figure out, were you roommates or were you spouses, right? If you all kept all of your money separate, never did you each put in money together to something, the person who owned the house, they paid for everything to do with it, it was always theirs, they bought all their own groceries, they bought all their own things, and this other person didn't contribute anything, well, maybe less likely that they're spouses. That'll be one of the factors that the court might consider. These are other factors, and I'll breeze through these a little bit. The court will look at how formal, what did they formalize in terms of their legal obligations? Did they write up a document? So some people might do that. They might say, we're entering into a adult interdependent relationship, and what does that mean to each of us? And let's set out what are our obligations and responsibilities. That would be indicative of a spousal adult interdependent relationship. The court could look at the direct and indirect contributions that each of the people have been making to each other. The court might look at that financial dependence or interdependence, and if there is that financial support. It's not unusual that you'll see a financial dependency grow as between spouses, particularly as the relationship goes on in time. It's not unusual that you'll see the support, financial support, going two ways, or if there is one with more money, it's not unusual that you'll see that support going to support the person who needs that finances. A court might look at the care and support of kids. Are there kids, and are we representing to the kids that we're a unit together? Are we caring and upbringing those kids and putting our time and labor into that? And the court might look at the ownership, the use, the acquisition of property. So when we buy a new car, do we buy it together, or is it my car? When we go and get insurance on the house, is it my house and I buy the insurance, or are we doing this together? The court will look at how together you are versus maybe you're just roommates. It's such an important thing for the court to try and determine that, are we roommates or are we spouses? But it can be quite fuzzy, or sometimes I call it hairy. It can be not that clear, especially when you have one person who may be incapable or has died, and the other person says, oh, we were spouses. The family says, oh my, no, you were roommates. Well, sometimes when you go through these factors and really look at them, it still remains a bit fuzzy, because it's also not unusual for roommates to start to have some financial independence. It's not unusual for roommates to say, I'm going to the grocery store, let me get what you need. And maybe they start doing their shopping and their cooking together. You may end up having roommates who are in many ways looking like spouses, in that they share, they share their lives, they watch TV together, they go to the movies together. Maybe they don't have intimate relationships together, but in other ways they're spouses, and that person may show up and say, yeah, well, why not? Why can't I be the spouse? And that would be a bit unexpected, perhaps, for that family. So how does this matter in terms of when somebody does die, which indeed we all are going to do. One day we all will die. So I had gone over in Alberta what would, that if you are married or in an adult interdependent relationship and then you break up while both people are alive, well, then the broken up spouses, they have a right to seek division of their property, of their assets, and they have a right to say, and I want support. I want some support coming in to help me live my life. Similarly, if two people are together, they're together in a marriage relationship or in an adult interdependent relationship, and then one of them dies, well, that surviving spouse has rights as well. So the surviving spouse in Alberta law means the surviving spouse or the surviving, there's the phrase, the adult interdependent partner of the deceased. So why we see these predatory marriages be increasingly a big deal is that if you are got together in your marriage or your adult interdependent relationship, one person dies, the surviving spouse has immediate rights to some part of that deceased person's assets and their estate. So if the deceased person, they die and they have a will, so they've written out, I'm looking around my office here to see if I have a will handy, I could just hold up, but I don't. But if they have a written will that's signed and says, this is what I want to, I'm going to die and this is my will, this is who's my executor, who's in charge, and this is what I want to happen with my stuff after I die. I want my house to go to this person. I want my, whatever it may be. If they die with the will, and there's this new spouse, this new married spouse, or this new interdependent spouse, that's not the end of the day. That person can sue the estate and say, I was the married spouse, I was the adult interdependent partner. There isn't anything for me in that will. Court, don't let that stand. Give me a share. Give me a share of that. That spouse will have a right to do that. And that right, one of the big concerns with those predatory marriages is that right to sue the estate to say, I want more from that estate if there's a will. It jumps up immediately upon the act of getting married. You are married. So immediately you have this right to sue the estate when the person dies to say, if it's not all to me, I want more of it. They can even say, I want all of it. And that may be a dramatic change to what people had been expecting. And we have lots of people out there in Canada who've had relationships where they've had a spouse and they've had kids, and 50 years went by and then one of them dies, and that other survivor lives, and maybe they live another 10 or 20 or 30 years, and everyone anticipated that what would happen is that the children will receive that estate when the last of the two parents dies. Well, if this other person swoops in and immediately becomes married, then they have a right to try and seek, in fact, the entire estate for themselves. That's the case if somebody dies with a will. It's in some ways almost worse if somebody dies without a will, because with the will, what the survivor would do is they have to go to the court and say, hey, court, I should get more. And that leaves the rest of the family or the other beneficiaries the ability to say, whoa, 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 no, no, no. They shouldn't get more, and they can describe the reasons why it wasn't really a valid marriage or something where any of those assets should go over. But if that spouse dies and they do not have a will, and the stats continue to be that a majority, so more than 50% of Canadians do not have a will. Despite our many efforts out there, most Canadians do not have wills. There's lots of people out there trying very hard to encourage Canadians to get wills. It does make things much simpler and much easier and allows that dignity and pride of having set your own will in place. But there's a lot of different barriers out there, including things like even thinking about death can be hard. Some people continue to have a sense that if they write out what's going to happen after they die, it will kind of bring upon their death. There's sort of a notion of, oh, I don't want to think about that. If I think about it too much, it might happen. Some people just don't know what to do. And then there's also financial barriers. It does often cost money to get a will done. And sometimes people just don't have or just don't want to spend their money in that way towards a will, or a lot of people just don't even know where to begin. They don't know how they do it. And so they just don't. But we know that most people in Canada die without a will. So if that spouse died without a will, then the one who survived immediately gets a share of the estate. And each of our provinces sets out how much do each of those people get. Immediately upon the death comes the right to be able to get it. So if there's a spouse, two of them there, one of them dies and they don't have any children, this person doesn't have any children, the surviving spouse gets everything. So that's sort of a real risk when we look at our predatory marriages, is that if all that you need to do is just get married, especially if you get married to somebody who is not doing well in their health and you think, I think they're going to die soon. Well, if you manage to get yourself married to them and then they die and they don't have a will, you immediately get the entirety of the estate if there's no kids. But even if there are kids, there's sort of a splitting upping. The kid, even if this person dies and they had some kids, that spouse is still going to get something, right? They often will get a half or a third, and then the kids, the surviving children, get the remainder. So even still, that's quite a significant amount. And the other part is that if there is a house, if there is a piece of real estate, so if it's a house, a townhouse, a condo, what have you, but if what that spouse who died owned was a residence of sorts, their surviving spouse has a right to stay living in that family home. They get this preferential right that exists there. And that makes a lot of sense for a lot of families, right? That, you know, these two people were living there as spouses in this house, and then one of them dies. It makes sense that the other one gets a right to live in that house. But if that spousal relationship, if that marriage relationship was done by a predator, boy, does that not feel right. When you'll then have a predator who has a right and is sitting there in the family home, and boy, is the family going to be pretty darn upset when they see that person they thought was conning their loved one and is now sitting there in the family home. That does not sit very well. The other, just before I move on to this capacity to marry, our laws across Canada are starting to shift, but they're not all totally complete. But Alberta is, in this sense. It used to be that by the very act of getting married, that would automatically invalidate any will that you had. So if you had a will and it said out, this is my executor, this is who I want to be my beneficiaries. Well, the moment you got married, that will is invalid. That was the law in all the provinces in Canada for a long time. Now, BC, we changed that law in 2020, 13. And Alberta has changed that law as well. And most of the other provinces are coming along as well. But that was part of our concern too. And part of the reason they changed that law, as a matter of fact, was this issue of predatory marriages. Was then you'd have somebody who would come in knowing this, and they'd say, okay, as long as I get married to that person, any will they have is thrown out, it's invalid, and I'm the spouse, so there's no will, and I'm gonna get at least half. That was the idea of the predator. Now we've helped out a little bit, perhaps by changing that little aspect of the law, but it's not a full, it hasn't helped everything. So I was going to talk a bit here about what is that capacity to marry. This is part of the problem, I would say. Now, when we look at things at law, everything that an adult wants to do in their life has a different test of capacity. Some people call it a hierarchy of capacity. And there are some things that are extremely simple to do, and we don't need to have a lot of cognition to do them. And there's some things that are more difficult to do, and we need to really be able to understand them. The law recognizes that. So that makes sense, right? If I wanted to set up a complex corporate commercial transaction, and I wanted to sell this $1 billion of assets, and I wanted to take this company public, and I wanted to do a whole series of very complex financial transactions, I've got to be pretty on it. I've got to be understanding a lot of different moving parts, a lot of different numbers, and have them all captured in my mind, and I can understand them and weigh my options. So the law would say something like that. You really need to know a whole lot. On the other hand, we have a case out of British Columbia where it was a bit of a sad case, where the court found that by opening a mouth by an adult who had a spoon pressed against their lower lip that was a little warm, that when she opened her mouth, she was expressing her capacity and her consent to eating. So she didn't, she couldn't orally speak anymore. She wasn't communicating otherwise, but she was able to open her mouth. And the court said, yeah, that's enough. That we get that. That's enough. So things like, hey, would you like to have a cup of water? You don't need to know what your money is in order to say, yeah, I'd like to have a cup of water. You don't need to know who your family is in order to say, yeah, I want to have that cup of water. You don't need to know where you are. You don't need to know what year it is. It's fine. You just say, I would like that cup of water. So the law will say, yeah, you really don't need much capacity to know you want that cup of water. You want to do everything to do with your finances. Boy, yeah, you really do need to know quite a bit about what's going on, who is this going to affect, what are the dollars, and that there's a range of everything sort of in the middle. So in between, did you want to have that cup of water, and do you want to do a $1 billion transaction? Somewhere along there falls the capacity to marry. So this is just our BC legislation. So we have a marriage act, and that's how we know how we legally come to be married. And there's nothing in any of those things that says, well, what is the capacity to get married? Similar for you guys in Alberta, there's no law, none of your laws that say, hey, there's an ability to get married. It's a provincial thing. The province of Alberta runs this, and the provinces of Alberta is in charge of figuring out the laws, in charge of issuing the licenses and registering the licenses to say, okay, yes, you guys, you can get married. You just apply for a license and off you go. And somebody then has a ceremony. It's all set out in our law. That's, often when we just think of getting married, we don't think it as being a very legal thing to do, but in fact, it is a very legal thing to do. And it's the province who sets up what are those legal structures that allow people to get married. But despite the legal contract, the legal act that is getting married, none of the laws set out what's the test of capacity. They just say, here's a license. You got to get a license. They don't say, and in order to get the license, you need to be able to know this. You need to be able to understand that. There's no test in our written law. So in our statutes, there's no test for what it is to get married. So when the courts want to look at this and what could or should be the test of capacity to get married, there are two weighing factors. So on the one hand, we want to, and the law and policy wants to respect an adult's autonomy. All of us as adults get to make our own decisions, good or bad ones. And we can marry the wrong guy, and we can marry the wrong gal, and we can marry the one that says, no, you know, your parents say, no way, Emily. You can only get married to somebody who is our faith. You can only get married to somebody who's our race. You can only get married to the one we pick for you. Don't marry that one. He's no good, or whatever the case may be. And I have a right as a Canadian to say, I'm doing it. I'm marrying the one I want because I want to. And maybe it's a bad choice, maybe it's a good choice, but I get to do it. So our law is quite strong on our rights of autonomy, we call it, our individual free choice. Our law would say that's important. We really value that. On the other hand, we've got vulnerable people. We've got vulnerable adults. We have an increasingly, we have an aging population that's coming up. And of that aging population, of course, not all of them will suffer from any diminishment of capacity, but some will. And our percentage of our population who will be suffering from some types of dementia or other health impacts that is causing a diminishment of their mental capacity is going to continue to be happening. So we've got these vulnerable people who may be reliant on others, who may be of diminished capacity, and the law would like to protect them. The law would like to say, we don't like you being taken advantage of. That's not good. We want to prevent that. On the other hand, we want adults to be able to make their choices. And so there's this great sort of jostling around of, well, where does the capacity to marry fall in that weighing? Because an adult may say, the adult may say, I'm 85. And you know what? I met this great guy and he is lovely and I love being around him. And you know what? I want to get married to him. This is exciting. It's thrilling. How joyful. And that person's family, they say, are you kidding me? No way. You do not even know that guy. You've just met him. You don't even know what's up. You are living in a care facility. You don't even know what's going on. No way. You cannot marry them. And we're balancing and we're wondering, oh gosh. And some people, it will be really right on that cusp where you're like, do you really want that? Do you really know what's going on? You want that? Oh, but you've actually been conned. Actually, that person is telling you all sorts of bad things about your family. They're telling you how much they'll help you, and that's not right. And it can be a bit of a hard one to balance out, to judge really what's going on. Our capacity to marry at law. So what does the law say? What have judges said over the years? Doesn't exactly, I think, so this is my opinion, I think our law about what is the capacity to marry, it doesn't really help things. Doesn't, as I'll go through in a little bit, I think it is quite dated. It was developed a long time ago in England, and I don't think it really applies anymore. And I don't think it really helps us, the public, when we're trying to figure out, oh, okay, like, is this just their choice and they can do what they want, or are they being preyed upon? I don't think that our law is really helping us right now in terms of when it sets out what is our capacity to marry. So what this slide shows is what the law would say is the capacity to marry right now. So the law, the judges, the written down reasons of the judges would say, well, in order to be capable to get married, you need to know more than just that you're having a marriage ceremony. So they say you must understand the nature of a marriage contract and the responsibilities of a marriage. That's what the law says. But what in the world does that mean? I would say, which is, what is the nature of a marriage contract and what are the responsibilities of marriage? Because people take those things to be extremely different. We all know people who will say, oh, what marriage means is this. And it means you're together every day, and it means you have joint finances, and it means you're having intimate relations, and it means you'll never do anything else. And other people will say, you know what marriage is to me is there's a nice person and we share some parts of our life, but I do other things. I maybe even have other intimate relationships. We don't even live together. And all of those things coexist. So when the law says, well, in order to be capable to get married, what you need to know is the nature of the marriage contract and the responsibilities of marriage. Well, what's that? What is that? It's so different for the individual. I would argue, and indeed I have tried to argue, that what that should mean, what does that mean should be, is not, but should be, that you need to understand that by getting married, you're getting yourself into a relationship that if you want to break up, you might owe that person some of your property, and you might owe them spousal support if you break up. And that if you die and you're still together, that person has a right to your estate, and they may have a part of your estate. They may get your stuff. So I think that should be required, but that our law isn't there yet. It's not quite there developed. And part of that is perhaps for valid reasons, right? Many people, I haven't used the word that many people use when they describe why they got married, which is that they love each other. I mean, many people would say that that's what marriage is, that marriage is about love. That when they got married to their person that they love and they got married to, they weren't thinking of what are the obligations of marriage. And if we break up, you've got property division and spousal support rights. And then there's these inheritance rights. Many people who are very, capable adults, not a vulnerable one out there, would be a little bit like, oh, that's not what I thought I was doing. I thought we loved each other and wanted to be together forever, and we were going to have a nice time with our families. So that's another aspect of marriage. I wrote the last line here. What is this capacity to marry? So the capacity to marry is considered in law to be a simple contract, a simple contract. So I just set out here on this slide here that there's these different tests of capacity for every action. There's kind of this hierarchy of capacity. There's the I want to have that cup of water. I really want to. There's the I want to do my $1 billion transaction. Well, marriage is described at law. The legal cases say that marriage is the simplest. It is the simplest thing you can do is getting married. So I put out a little bit here. This is just a little bit of a history lesson for those who might be interested. Why is it that the capacity to marry is the simplest thing that you could possibly do? Well, it stems back to this case from 1885 over in England there, where the court was asked to determine that a marriage was invalid. And I have argued that, our whole legal concept that marriage is the simplest is so outdated. We just need to reject this and have a look at things in the modern times. And if any of you out there are ever in this situation, I'll encourage you to keep fighting this fight because it seems so obvious to me. But, in this case, it was a bit, the word I like to use is pernicious. It seemed obvious that this was going to be the result of the judge. But in this one, Lord Durham came to the court and said, when I'm married, little Susie over there, she was crazy. She was so crazy that when we got married, it should be void. It should be as if it never was, because she was incapable of getting married. So what had happened is Lord Durham there had married a woman. Gosh forbid, a couple of years went by, she became depressed, a couple of more years went by, and she, we wouldn't use these words now, but sort of went crazy. And she kept saying the reason that she was so upset is she didn't love him. And he said, well, that's absolutely crazy. How would you not love me? Well, Lord Durham wasn't really the nicest of fellows there, but at that day and age, he couldn't get divorced. And at that day and age, here was his wife, and she was we'd call it in a care facility. She was having to have care because her mental health was really bad and she couldn't live at home anymore. And he was stuck paying for her and he did not want that. So he couldn't get divorced. He was paying for her. He'd like to go and be with some other lady, which was not proper giving those times. So he came to the court and said, court, she's actually always been crazy. Let me get out of this relationship and give her back. I don't want anything to do with her anymore. Well, the court wasn't in that time going to let him get away with that. And so this was the whole origin of, or what's the capacity to marry, it came out of those kind of unique set of facts. And at that time, our judge there described what is marriage? What is the contract of marriage that you need to understand? Well, you need to know that the contract of marriage is that it requires protection, that the man will protect the woman and the woman will submit to the man. That was the notion of marriage that in that time the judge said was so simple to understand. Who couldn't understand that? It just means the man protecting the woman and the woman submitting to the man. Now, I think I'm putting a little, ham in my voice on that because I think it to be fairly obvious that in our modern time that we don't believe that when people are getting together to get married, that what they're agreeing to is I'm a woman and you're a man. Better not be a man and a man or a woman and a woman. Ugh. Number one. And number two, that I'm the woman, I'm going to submit to you and you, the man, are going to protect me. Like, I don't think that many people these days would say that that's what they understand is the nature of the contract of marriage. But through sort of time and history, that is the origin of why it is we say marriage is so simple. It's coming back to this. This is another way that the courts have been looking at that test and sort of trying to develop it and trying to say that, well, what is that contract of marriage and what do you need to know? Well, some courts have said, well, marriage involves that you have to live together, you have to cohabit, and you have to make a home together. Well, I just pause there because there's lots of people out there who are married, and you know what they don't do is they don't live in the same place. And maybe there's lots of reasons for that. One of them has business over here and one of them has business over there, and they just don't even live nearby. There's some other married spouses who say, do you know what? You know how we are best together is when we each have our own separate residence, and that works really well for us. And they're still married. But this law would say, okay, here's what the nature of a marriage is. You got to cohabit. You've got to make financial provision for each other. Well, again, in our modern times, we know that actually a lot of marriages go forward and they don't commingle their finances. They live in separate financial lives, and that's fine. So our law would say, well, that's the nature of the marriage. You cohabit and you make financial provision, and yet there's lots of people who don't do that. So it makes me wonder if that description of what a marriage is really valid anymore. And the last one there is to consider in the appropriate circumstances the possibility of having children. That may be applicable to certain people in certain times of their lives, but it's certainly not going to be applicable to other people in other phases of their lives. So I wonder really that when you're getting married, and what is it that you need to know? I don't think you need to know, oh, we should be having children. When the 90-year-old is saying that to the 95-year-old, I don't really think that that's what's going on. Oops. So what I thought would be helpful is, and I just looked at my clock over here, so it's 9:45. I think I'll probably be another sort of 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll have a good opportunity here for questions after that. So I thought some examples would be helpful to put a little bit of a real lifedness to this. So in this case, sorry about all that legal notation at the top, all that's saying is that there is this case out of Ontario about Mr. Sung, the Re-Sung estate, from 2004. So in that case, the court over there did find that a marriage was invalid. The court there said, when the court said, oh yeah, you need to understand the nature of the contract of marriage. And then that court said, okay, well, what is that nature of the contract of marriage? They said, you've got to understand the state of the previous marriages. You've got to understand who is your own children. Who are they? Do you have children? And how your kids may be affected. So that was one court's take on, well, what do you need to know in order to get married? Now, in that case, sorry, pause there. My headset was sort of giving me some noises there, but in that case, there was Mr. Sung. He lived in Ontario. He had 5 children. Without any of the children knowing, one day their dad became married to a Miss Feng. Miss Feng was his caregiver. They became married about 6 weeks before Mr. Sung died. At the time that this marriage happened, Mr. Sung was quite ill. He had lung cancer. He had Parkinson's disease. His children argued that that marriage was a nullity, saying, or the marriage was invalid or no good or never even happened, because they say that their dad really didn't have the capacity to enter into that contract. Part of the evidence was that Miss Feng, who was the caregiver, she received, I put that in a neutral way, 30,000 from Mr. Sung directly, and then she had also withdrawn about $26,000 from his bank accounts. She would go to his bank account sometimes up to 6 times in one day in order to get money out of his bank account. So that was one where it seemed obvious enough or clear enough to the court that this was a woman who took advantage of an older adult who was sick, who certainly met a definition of vulnerable in that he was very ill. He was needing care in order to meet his daily needs. They got married without anybody in the family knowing, really quickly. And it all had all these kind of red flags or signs of really not being for anything other than coming to be a married spouse in order to get part of his estate. I'll talk in a minute about the awfulness of sort of undoing these things in a case that I was involved in, but this case I can tell because I know what those sort of words at the very top there mean. This went on for years, and in fact they had to go all the way to court. And then they had to have an appeal. So this family, these 5 children of Mr. Sung were dealing with this, I would guesstimate, for 5 or 6 years before the whole thing got undone. And I can only imagine the legal bills to be extraordinary. You know, for that simple act of, you know, taking Mr. Fung down there to the office, getting that marriage done, probably took them 15 minutes and $100. Well, it probably took 5 or 6 years and a whole lot more bucks to undo that simple thing that was done. This is a different case. So this was a 2014 case, Ross Scott, and it was out of British Columbia. And it was an interesting case where ultimately the court said that marriage was valid. So in that case, these 2 people were neighbors. So they were neighbors on in British Columbia, we have some islands sort of in between Vancouver and Vancouver Island, and they're relatively small communities. And these 2 people were neighbors over there on a relatively small island. Mr. Groves was 77 years old. He was a retired civil engineer. He came into a relationship with his neighbor, Miss Potvin. She was 56 years old. They did become married, and she became the beneficiary of his estate after he died. His, I think it was nephews, ultimately challenged that and said, no, that marriage should be declared invalid because our uncle, he was starting to decline. His cognition was drifting, and she took advantage of them. Now, or him, I should say. Part of what was interesting about that case is it was a quote unquote modern marriage. So they never had intimate relationships. They never lived together. They never intended to live together. In fact, the evidence was is they got married as part of a deal between the two of them, that he thought to himself, well, here I am, I'm getting a little bit older. I'm living in this kind of remote community and there's nobody here to take care of me. He didn't have any kids. And then he met this neighbor who seemed like a nice and caring woman, and she had time on her hands. And so the deal they entered into is she would take care of him and she would help him out and she would look in on him and make sure that he was doing okay. And in exchange, she would get everything that he had and they would get married. So it was a very modern marriage, a very modern take on what is marriage. There was no, oh, we loved each other. She never said that because that wasn't what it was. They got married as part of a deal that would see him being taken care of, and in some ways her being taken care of. And the argument was, well, he didn't know what he was doing when he got into that, and that's not marriage. That was a scam. That was her taking him for money. And the court ended up saying, no, that was a modern marriage and it was okay, and he had enough capacity to enter into it. There was evidence as well in that case that he was starting to have some cognitive impairments, that his ability to write checks or making deposits at banks was starting to become impaired. So he was starting to feel some impairments of a cognitive decline. But the court said, no, but he had enough wherewithal to understand the contract, so to speak, he was getting into, and allowed this marriage to stand. This is the case where I was involved in. I was counsel for the DeVore Thompson side of this case, and it finally came heard here in BC in 2017. This was a case that I argued was a clear case of a predatory marriage. So in this case, there was two Donnas. Let's just say that they called themselves and their family Big Donna and Little Donna, and Big Donna was the aunt to Little Donna. Big Donna, it's a bit funny because she really wasn't very big, but Big Donna lived over here in the lower mainland. The rest of her family lived over in Alberta, and Big Donna was a career independent woman. She moved out here away from her family, and she lived a life, and she had had a couple of spouses along the way, but those had broken down, and she didn't have kids, but she had some jobs and had friends and was enjoying her life over here. She had an extremely close relationship with her family, and in particular, her niece, Little Donna, who also, as her life moved over, ended up settling into the lower mainland. As time went by, and Big Donna was a single woman living in a condo that she owned out in the lower mainland here, she did start to suffer from an Alzheimer's disease and started to have some dementia. Little Donna went with her, and they went to a geriatric psychologist, and they said, yeah, you should start to put your affairs in order, Big Donna. It looks like you have Alzheimer's disease. And that's a devastating blow to everyone, of course. But on they went and got their papers in order, and got Little Donna signed up to be a power of attorney, and had a will in place, giving things amongst the family. Time went by, and then along showed up this man, Mr. Poulain. And the evidence came out that what seemed to be happening is that Mr. Poulain noticed Big Donna. Big Donna had some noticeable signs of having Alzheimer's disease. Her gait, like her walking, was affected. She had a little bit of a distant look. She started struggling, as can happen with motor movements. The brain can kind of forget, in a way, how to move its body. And you can sometimes see people who are struggling with dementia. Well, it turned out what happened is Mr. Poulain said to Big Donna, something had happened or what have you, and he said he needed a little bit of money, and if she gave him $20 and she gave him her address, that he would get whatever it is he needed. He'd lost his wallet or something, and he'd get that $20 back to her. She gave him his address, and then he just started to show up. That was the evidence of the family, is that this guy is here, and this guy is, oh my God, this guy again. And they kept seeing this guy, what in the world is going on? And they would ask Big Donna, what's going on with this guy? And she'd say, I don't know, what's up with this guy? He keeps being around. Well, time ticked by and time ticked by. And despite all efforts, one day off there, Mr. Poulain took Big Donna and they became married. He had applied a few weeks earlier. He scooted down to like the London Drugs, filled out the form for the marriage license. Very easy to do. Paid his $100 or what have you. And then a few weeks later said to Big Donna, hey, Big Donna, let's go, or whatever he said. We don't really know what happened. And they scooted themselves down to the marriage commissioner's condo. You can just find a marriage commissioner on the internet, marriage commissioner. There you go, you'll find him. And here's a guy, and he did it right inside his condo. And the witnesses were his wife and his daughter. And so in they went into the condo, and the marriage commissioner came up and gave evidence in the trial. And the marriage commissioner said, he tests people for capacity before he issues the marriage license. Oh, what did you do to do that? I mean, he's a very nice man. I'm not criticizing him. He's done thousands of marriages. And he said, well, I asked them if they would like to marry the person standing beside them. And I ask them if there is any reason they cannot get married. And if they say to me the words yes and no in that order, then I will marry them. Because they have said, yes, I'd like to marry that person. Is there any reason you cannot? No. And I said, do you need to know that they need to be able to say their name? No, no. Do they need to be able to say the name of that person over there? No, 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 no. Do they need to say anything else? No, no, no. They need to be able to say yes, followed by the word no. So anyways, they got married. Time ticks by, they got married. Big Donna, really her health starts to suffer. She ends up going into a long-term care facility and then dying. And then she is married when it is that she dies. And Mr. Poulain says, haha, we were married. And at that time, any will she had was automatically revoked by law. And look at this, I'm the married spouse and I should get her entire estate. Somewhat of the rub of this case was that her entire estate wasn't very large. She had a condo out in the valley. She had a couple of $100,000 that she'd worked really, really hard to earn. And that's all that she had. So we weren't fighting over a tremendous amount, but he said, aha, no, we were married, and we were married because we were in love. This was a love marriage. And it sort of fell apart when poor Mr. Poulain there was on the stand, because I asked things like, well, what did you like to do together? And he said, well, we would watch TV. I said, well, what did you watch on TV? We watched shows. Oh, what shows? The shows. Well, what shows? Well, the shows that she liked. Well, what shows did she like? Well, she liked the ones that she liked quite a lot. Well, which were they? The ones she liked. And it sort of went around in circles like that, because as it turned out through the evidence, he really didn't know very much about her and had spent very little time with her. He tried to argue that they lived together. Oh, what are you saying that you lived together? Oh, well, one of my shirts was there. It sort of all kind of sort of fell apart in that, but he did argue that their marriage was based on love. And that he was asking her to give him money, that he was taking her to the bank and they were withdrawing her maximum amounts every day, and that he was always there, and the bank came up as to testify as well. Oh, we always saw him there with her at the bank machine. That he said that didn't matter because they were doing this for love. I could go on about those facts. That one, I would say, to be fair about it, was one where it was fairly obvious to the court that this was a predatory marriage. His evidence was very poor in terms of he didn't really seem to actually have much to do with her. And the evidence was extremely clear about her decreasing mental capacities. We had some reports. We had her treating geriatric psychiatrist come and give a report that said she really had diminished and just kept diminishing in her capacity. And the family gave evidence of, by the time that they were married, she was struggling with, things like how to come to sit in a chair. And this does happen to people who have Alzheimer's. Their brain is in some ways forgetting how to do these things, such that she would approach a table and look at a fork and knife and not know, what does one do with that? And how does one hold it in your hand? She would come to a chair and sometimes, she would put her head onto the bottom of the chair because she had, her brain was not sure what to do with that object of a chair. And it was around that time that she became married to him. And he said, oh, she knew just exactly what was going on. And we really loved each other and we wanted to spend the rest of our lives together. Well, at the same time, she wasn't sure how to sit in a chair or use a fork. You know, those things were made it a fair, I would say, a fairly obvious case of an incapacity to marry. But as with the prior case there, boy, did it take a lot of time, and boy, did it take a lot of money to try and undo an act which had like cost $100 and took 15 minutes. That's the real rub of this whole thing, and why there are those of us who are saying, oh, these predatory marriages, and geez, we should be really looking at what's going on here, because for $100 in 15 minutes, you might take years and your life savings to try and undo this. And the evidence that little Donna gave is, you know, she just had to do it. She said it was so wrong. It was so, and I just can't let this stand. And it really, at some point, like, didn't even become about the money. Nobody was going to win in terms of the money. It was just that she couldn't let it stand. And there will be many people out there who will say, it's wrong. I know it's wrong, but I can't spend the next 6 years and all of my money fighting about this. And I think that's a reality. That's partly why we're so worried about these predatory marriages. I think this is the last case I wanted to give you an example of. This is a 2017 case that came out of Ontario. And in this case, there was a Mr. Hunt. He had been involved in an ATV accident, and he had suffered with a catastrophic brain injury. He ended up being in a coma for 18 days, and eventually he did recover, so much so that he was released from hospital and he was allowed to return home. Before his accident there, I mean, he had a traumatic brain injury, and that it occurred in a second, different than those with Alzheimer's, where it can tend to be a slow progress over time. But before his accident, he had been in an on-again, off-again relationship with a woman named Miss Warrett. And after the accident, Mr. Hunt's sons noticed that their dad was missing. They went to go visit him at home. He'd been released from the hospital. He was back home and he was missing. Using his credit card purchase history, they got a hold of that and they were able to track where he was. And they found out that he was in a hotel and with Miss Warrett, and that, in fact, there was a wedding. And in fact, the wedding had already taken place. And in fact, Miss Warrett and Mr. Hunt had become married. So some people from her family were present, but nobody from Mr. Hunt's side of the equation were in there. Ultimately, the court did find that Mr. Hunt there lacked the capacity to get married, and that Miss Warrett had arranged for that. She had a lot of the red flags, if you will, of what is to not be done if you want to successfully get away with a predatory marriage, which, she had done it, she had been using his money. She had gotten married with him secretly and really quickly. Nobody in his family knew about it. She actually just went over one day and picked him up and drove away, and he was gone. And it didn't have those indicia of a relationship that was for valid purposes, and there was medical evidence that that was a bit on the line. So he had a traumatic brain injury, but he could still function. He was living at home, so he had some capacities, but there was some evidence that yes, he could understand and do some things. There was some evidence to say but the brain injury had really affected his judgment, his ability to make good decisions, and so the court had to weigh that, ultimately deciding that marriage was invalid. Again, it's one of those, the lesson that isn't apparent necessarily when you just read the case or hear these examples is the years and the money that goes into undoing the thing that all that she needed to do was show up, grab the guy, drive away, have it all arranged, get it done, and $100 and done. And then it's years and time to undo that. So that was the end of the examples that I had to share with you. And what I thought is I'll just talk, and I know that this is right up the core alley of what the organization does, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just thought I would talk a little bit about elder abuse, because this is sort of what I see, and what we see these predatory marriage cases, we see this as a type of an elder abuse. So Elder abuse occurs where harm is caused or adequate care isn't provided to an older adult. It might be physical, it might be financial, it might be psychological, it might be sexual, it might be neglect. Some warning signs could be, in the physical form, unexplained injuries or changes in weight or torn clothing or something like that. There may be controlling behavior that can be seen. It could be by a caregiver, it could be by another person who seems to be exhibiting that controlling behavior. Signs that may look like dementia, that I listed out some of those there that we have, that you may see in people. A change in living conditions of an unsanitary condition or a poor hygiene. Sometimes we see that, and that was the case as well in that Devore Thompson case I was counsel, and there was a lot of evidence about Big Donna being a woman of a lot of pride and a lot of flair, who always took great care in her looks and her makeup and the way that she presented her house. And by the time Mr. Poulain was involved, her attire was unkept, it was unclean, her place was unclean in a way that the family had never seen it be her whole life. Some signs of elder abuse may be changes in spending or finances, changes of an estate plan, or unusual or unnecessary purchases. There was a recent publication that came out. These days I happen to be the chair of the BC Law Institute, and part of the BC Law Institute is the Canadian Centre for Elder Law. And we recently just did an update, and that is now published and all available on the internet. And it's the Practical Guide to Elder Abuse and Neglect Law in Canada. So it is a helpful resource, and if I can figure it out, I can put it in the chat, the link to so you can get to that. It's a helpful guide, and it's a guide that does go across Canada and does try to be practical in terms of being a resource for people who may be seeing this in their lives. Part of the difficulty that we find, and probably you have found in dealing with things like elder abuse or predatory behaviors too, isn't helped by that each of our provinces have slightly different laws, which does make things tricky, but that guide does try to go across Canada to try and give people some resources there. That was the end of the presentation that I had prepared. It's about just 10 past 10, and I think we have some more time, so I will turn it over to Chantal or whoever that may be who may want to moderate some questions. I haven't been following the chat. It's possible there's questions in there, but I will stop sharing my screen and we'll move to that part of the presentation.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm just going to double check with our chat box moderator here, Amanda, I think. Have you noticed, is there anything in the chat box?
No, there are no questions at this time, but I see Charlene has a hand up, so maybe I'll let her speak.
Thanks, Charlene. Go ahead.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Emily. That was so great. I'm trying to take notes, and my hand is sore because you had so many wonderful things that you talked about. And I mean, we see this far more now that it's been brought to our attention. We see it so much. And it's so frustrating because it seems as though that there's very little that we can be done prior to the damage. So my question is, as someone who from time to time has conversations with some older adults who it looks like they're entering into these relationships that might not result in marriage, but are certainly, there's predatory behavior that's being expressed by caregivers, people who are putting themselves in positions of care for people who don't have anyone else, but have a significant amount of money. What kind of strategies do you think you talked about? Helping people understand the obligations of marriage, the obligations of the relationship. what kind of strategies could you suggest that we have for having conversations with older people who, you know, there's just so much wrong here, but you're trying to respect their right to make bad decisions? Yeah, do you have any strategies?
Yeah, I can talk about some things, and you're right to have identified too. It's that right to make a bad decision, and it's also, you know, especially dealing with older adults, you don't want to. Nobody wants to cause them even more distress and upset and anxiety because there's a thing and they're enjoying the thing, or somebody's telling them that they're enjoying this thing, and it's also a sense of, you know, none of us want to cause more upset, and you sort of don't want to be constantly poking into somebody's eye to say, remember how disabled you are? Don't you remember? Like, that isn't part of what we usually want to do when we're supporting somebody who is dealing with some type of a disability where they're vulnerable or need support. So what are some things, some actual things that can be done? You know, and I suspect in your community as well, you have this idea of this like eyes on, right? That we have an idea that the more people see the vulnerable adult, the more safe the vulnerable adult will be. And having other people, as many people as you can, in a sense, you know, seeing that adult and being able to, you know, number one, reflect back to the adult, this seems a bit, this seems a bit funny. I'm not sure about this, or what's going on with this? Maybe not even being judgmental, but just saying, what's going on with this? That's helpful. It's helpful as well to have those other people who might be able to notice something, notice a change, be there in case, in the unfortunate case where they have to like give some evidence, so to speak, to say, oh yeah, I noticed that too. Sometimes where we end up seeing a predator sort of you know, get away with it, if you will, is that they try to go after people who are more isolated, right? Because people who are more isolated, there's less people around who may be able to intervene or step in or have a concern. So having, you know, our older adults having lots of people in their lives is to their benefit, so that they can notice something and maybe try to prevent it, or if it needs be, to have more people be able to say, yeah, I saw that too. Yeah, I saw that too. So it's not such a case of like, oh, but you're just the niece or what have you who just wants the estate and you're just lying about this. If there's other people who say, oh yeah, no, I saw that too, that's of assistance. With everyone, we would recommend, I mean, this is true for everyone. We say, you know, get your estate planning done, get it done early, get it done before anything goes wrong. And we would say that like to everybody, you know, are you 20, get a will. I would say that to everybody, but it can become more important too as time goes by. There are some ways, you know, if somebody would go and hire a lawyer. Now, lawyers are expensive, so it's not realistic for everybody. But if you can hire a lawyer, that can be really helpful. There are some trust planning ideas that a lawyer can have that can put some assets a little bit farther away, if you will. And sometimes that's a really good idea, is to let the adult have access to their money and have that independence and ability. But sometimes you can arrange it. You know, you have to deal with the adult, and they need to be thoughtful about this. Sometimes even they will agree, yeah, you know, actually there's too much money there. There's too much complexity there. I don't really want to manage it. I want to have enough money that I can do what I want to do, and I don't need to tell you every day that I want a popsicle. Can I have one, please? No, but you can do some trust planning that would put the money a little bit farther away in someone else's hands to manage. And that may end up having a protectionary effect in terms of, even if a predator kind of can crawl in the door, if all that they end up having access to is the day-to-day checking account with $10,000, maybe you say, well, fine, right? So that there can be some options in there, but that would involve sort of going to a lawyer and thinking about that and working on that. Just a couple of other things. It's always tricky, I'm sure you found, in terms of getting people to keep getting medical, not access, but views by medical people, right? So having current and up-to-date assessments of capacity, having, you know, that GP, or if there is a a geriatric psychologist or a geriatrician who's on the case to bring that adult and to be talking to that person to say, I'm a bit worried about this. You have a sense of this, so that if anything does go wrong, that you'd have that medical evidence to go back and rely on. I don't know. I'm sorry that I can't give this answer. There's this one other thing. So in British Columbia, so that's only helpful for British Columbia people. We do have this thing called a caveat on a marriage, that you can file a caveat with the licensing people. So the part of the British Columbia government who issues marriage licenses, there is an ability to file a caveat on a marriage to, if you can say, this adult is incapable, here's a bit of evidence to say the marriage, that the adult is incapable, don't allow the issuing of a marriage license. We have that in BC. It is extraordinarily rare in use. Like almost nobody knows about it, almost nobody uses it, but it is there. And I don't know if Alberta has such a similar type of a thing, but if that type of a thing existed, that is another sort of an option that could be, all that could potentially prevent is a marriage. It's harder to prevent an adult interdependent relationship in that sense, right? Because we don't worry, we call it predatory marriage, partly because it's a sort of a phrase that people get, right? And we're trying to say, hey, there's a problem here. So we describe it as a predatory marriage, but it could be also a predatory common law relationship, right? Where somebody moves in, and that's a predatory thing in itself because they're trying to become a spouse by just time passing. There's no easy answer though. You faced it, and we all should be sort of thinking and working on this, but it's always a tricky one.
Great, thanks for your answers. That was excellent. Amanda, was there any questions in the chat box?
Yes, we did get a question from Michelle from the city of Fort Saskatchewan, and she asks, Emily, can predators be charged criminally? Do we have any basis on that?
Yeah, so that's, I could talk quite a bit about that too. So and that's actually a bit of an answer to the past question too, is maybe it's appropriate to report it to the police. There are laws out there about fraud, right? That people cannot commit fraud. What we have seen is that we don't see a lot moving forward in terms of criminal charges on this kind of a type of fraud. We do see big fraud charges, like fraud is a real thing and it moves forward in those criminal charges, but we don't often see it applied in this. And we wonder, if it would be really hard in some ways for the police to know what's going on. But perhaps as society is moving on and maybe there's more resources focused on this, perhaps it is that the police may use more of their tools under the criminal law to look into some of these things. And it is possible you could see a charge coming from a criminal charge, although we see those incredibly rarely. I can tell you that I'm part of a national working group here where we're looking at proposals to see, should there be more crimes, so to speak. That was a very bad way of saying it, but should there be amendments to the criminal code, right? So that there would be specific crimes that would be attached to an elder abuse type situation. Now, right now, elder abuse, so to speak, isn't a crime. Of course, if it's unconsensual touching, that's a crime, as in the physicality is always a crime and it should be reported to the police. But this overall concept of the controlling, the domineering, that's not a crime right now, and our national elder law group is working on thinking about, could we, what would that look like if we wanted to bolster up the criminal law, because maybe that's a way we can try and protect people. So even though there's not that crime of elder abuse now, is it possible that we could see that in the future? It's possible. There's people out there and we're thinking about it and working on it. The other part of that is I'm sort of working on a couple of things out here, and so are others across the country, of should we make it a not a criminal wrong, but a civil wrong, right? And in our world, we would call a civil wrong a tort. That's just the fancy legal word, such that maybe you could sue somebody and you could say, you've committed elder abuse. And you've committed elder abuse in that you've been domineering, you've been isolating, whatever those things are. And so we want the court to intervene to say, you know, number one, stop doing that. And number two, here's some, you know, money in exchange for your pain and suffering, so to speak. Now, these days, that is not a thing. It's not a thing in our law, but there's, you know, people around the country who are trying to push that forward, because we see this, you know, elder abuse, we see it increasing, and we think that there should be consequences to it. So it, you know, it could be possible in the future too that we see that the tort of elder abuse, or the civil wrong of elder abuse, that wouldn't be prosecuted through the police, but perhaps could be something that we could have our courts do on a, you know, person to person sort of civil level. But that's something that is not here now, but maybe it could come in the future. The last point I would make there, just about the police, is we do hear increasingly from the police that they are concerned about this, right? They hear more and more about it. They're being called in more and more about it. And we hear the police wanting more education and wanting more resources. And maybe it eventually will be that they get more sort of wanting to do that, and having the manpower and the staffing and the budget to do that type of work, to take advantage of the existing laws as they are. I imagine that will start to come, because the police are our first line for so many people. You know, for so many people, you say, oh, go hire a lawyer, and they'll go like, what? Like, you know, who do I even call, and how much money? Oh my gosh. But people know how to call the police. They know how to do that. So maybe our police will have an increasing role in terms of working on elder abuse kind of issues.
Great, thanks, Emily. Can I share one story about one that we dealt with here, where it was an older gentleman and he had some early signs of kind of dementia starting, and he needed some care. His wife had recently passed and he was quite deep in grief, but was also worth quite a lot of money. And so he went out and was looking for a caregiver. And so he put up posters at some of the local coffee shops, and ended up having a lady move in. And she went from being a caregiver to eventually sleeping in his bedroom and being an intimate partner. But there was also lots of red flags along the way, that he was paying for everything, and that she was really manipulating him in a lot of different ways, and just even some of the messaging. And so he paid for her to go down east where her family was, to go for a visit and different things. And he was planning to go and join her. But in the meantime, while she was out there, his nieces and nephews got wind of this relationship happening and came down and had a chat with him, and were expressing their concerns. And the niece and nephew actually went to the police, and the police suggested a no contact order since she was out of the house. And it was really the manipulation that she was doing that was causing a lot of harm and things. So he agreed to that. Again, I think a little bit around his cognition too. So yep, she's away. Oh yeah, that is terrible. Okay, yeah, I'd want to no contact with her. And then he would want contact with her and different things. But I will say that even that reporting and putting in place that no contact order, the police, it kind of scared her off actually. And so she didn't end up coming back, and she ended up leaving, and the situation thankfully didn't escalate. And then in the meantime, I guess the niece and nephew were able to put in some other additional safeguards and help him to find an appropriate caregiver and different things. But it really could have gone down a very bad path. And I think maybe the involvement of police sometimes can also be a deterrent, depending on how, I guess, intent the person is on scamming the person. But just a thought as well.
That's an excellent example. Sad situation. You know, you sort of hate to hear that, but we do hear of those situations. And the key thing there too was that he wanted that too. So he was able to notice it. He was able to express that intention. And some people will find situations where the person, adult, will say, no way. No way, they only want the best for me. There's no, and so would, oh, I will not talk, no way would they involve that. So you never know which way it's going to go.
Yeah, that's the tough thing. And I will say he did waffle back. Like he was like, no, I absolutely love her and I don't care. I want to give her everything. but then it was like, you could tell the cognition wasn't there because he was very much easily swayed by depending on who was around him and the messages he was getting. So I think that strengthened the fact that he needed decision makers in place as well. But Charlene, I did see that your hand was up. Did you still have a question or has it been answered?
Well, it was, but I have another one. Surprise, surprise. So just what you were speaking of there, Chantal, you know, we see things like that as well. The really difficult situations are when people do not have any family to advocate for them, like the niece and nephew. And so those become even more challenging because then who becomes that voice, that advocate for that person? And, you know, I guess that's where many of us who are on the webinar today may find themselves in a role similar to that, but that becomes very challenging as well for lots of different reasons. So, but statistically, we know that there are a lot of people who are going to go through the baby boom wave who don't have family. I mean, it's challenging enough to clean up an elder abuse situation when it's family. When people don't have anyone, that becomes, from my perspective anyway, even more complicated.
The other idea I would just put out there to Charlene, to your earlier question is, we have in each of the provinces a wing, I suppose, of the government called the public guardian and trustee. That's what ours is called. And I think yours is also called the public guardian and trustee. And at least out here, you can also report a situation to our public guardian and trustee, and they can investigate a situation, and they out here, and I'm confident out in Alberta, have powers to act if they see that there is a vulnerable adult who is subject to financial abuse. You know, they don't, as I'm sure you probably would see too, they don't always act, and it's not a guarantee, but that's another layer of potential resource, if you will, for trying to deal with a situation, is to see if the public guardian and trustee could become involved.
Thanks for that. I see Irene, you have your hand up. Do you have a question?
Sure. More just a comment. First of all, thanks so much for your presentation, Emily, and also for your continued vigilance on this matter nationally. I think it gives me hope to hear that there are people like you out there continuing to work on these issues. I think I was just going to mention that one of the challenges, and maybe, I don't know, I'm certainly not suggesting anything to the law people because that's not my field of expertise, but just if there's any way to collaborate at all with the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee, because I've been through a number of situations in Alberta where I work rural and remote Alberta, and the Public Trustee's Office won't get involved if capacity is not an issue. And they're very, very firm on that. And so the issue becomes if they deem that, if they just question, does the individual have capacity? And if there has not been a capacity assessment that says that there is capacity issues and they do not have capacity, then they will not get involved. And it is a challenge. And I think there is a gray area between that office, and I don't know nationally, but certainly in Alberta, the office and the legal suggestions and work that you're doing. And I'm wondering if there's any discussions that happen between what you're doing at the provincial and national level and those offices, because I've just run into, and it's not marriages, it's where, as Charlene has mentioned as well, where people have come in as caregivers. And I've had, just in the last 6 months, 2 situations in rural remote areas of Alberta where, full large farming families' histories have been taken over and spent. And, in one case, the 90-year-old, well, almost 89-year-old was actually evicted by the caregiver off his own property. He had been moved first to a shack on the property, and there was large tracts of property. So he was removed into a wooded area in one of the hunting shacks, and then we were able to move him into somewhere much, obviously much more appropriate. But even by that point, the money and that family farm that had been in there for generations had been spent. And when we brought it forward to the Office of the Guardian and Public Trustee, the issue was capacity. He did have capacity, but when it's that coercive control, when they've been isolated and on their own, and that's the only person that's going to help them and care for them, it's that coercive control. So I don't know how legally you get around that, but I guess that's a long-winded bit of a story and a question to say, is there any discussions with those offices and what you're doing legally? Because I think there's a huge gray area there. Thank you.
Yeah, and I can say from my experience out here, I work in private practice, so to speak. So I act for humans who have problems, and I've perceived what you have in terms of our public guardian and trustee is that their first move when a report comes is to seek a capacity assessment from a GP. If there is no GP, or the person refuses to, then maybe things just even crumble at that point. But unless they get that, oh yeah, they're incapable, then I also see what you've seen, that they're probably not going to act. So that we have this like real services come if it seems that they're incapable. But what of those many people we all know of who are in that grayish zone, where maybe incapable, maybe not. GPs are very loath to say incapable for a lot of valid reasons, to respect the adult and their rights. And, what do you even mean? Because there's this capacity hierarchy and that can get very tricky. So I've perceived similarly that it can be hard regarding, whether the public guardian and trustee will become involved. Out here, we're trying. There's various sort of working groups and other committees out here who are trying in BC at the very least to work with that and bring these things forward. Our BC, we have a couple of different laws out there that deal with this, and the public guardian and trustee just announced the other day that they're going to we're going to do a review of our adult abuse and neglect framework, which is part of what our law is. So there is some movement towards, gathering more information and seeing somewhat where those gaps are. Although sort of the solutions, who yet knows? But I think as you say, anything that anybody can do to try to, continue to, jump up and down and put fireworks in the air to say, oh my golly, there is this section of our population who is our vulnerable older adults, especially those who do not have family members. Boy, what is going to happen to them? And it should not be that it's just, oh yeah, you're capable or incapable. Yeah, things will happen if you are, but not if you're not. That doesn't seem totally like it's going to fit the needs of our population. So jumping up and down wherever we can to try and flag the issues, I think is an important thing to keep on trying to do.
Agreed.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Irene. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments? Okay, not seeing any. I'm just gonna share my screen here, maybe if I can figure out how to do that. For a minute, I've just lost myself. There we go. Just wanted to let everybody know about the opportunity to join our core platform if you haven't already done so. You can join through corealberta.ca, and our elder abuse group is on there. Just click join and you'll be able to be part of that. We will be sharing the link for this recording on there, as well as the PowerPoint. Thank you to Emily for allowing us to both record and to share that with our group. As well, you can take part in some conversations and some messaging on there if that's of interest to you. There's a discussion board and different things that you can always post on and become active in that group. We also just want to thank Emily today for sharing her knowledge and her information on this really important topic. It's unfortunate that it is a topic that we need to discuss, but I think it's one that we really need to start paying attention to and seeing how we can highlight it and raise the issue and bring it forward, because I do think, as she's highlighted here for us, that it's going to continue to be an issue and a growing issue, unfortunately. And I've learned a lot around the risk factors and some of the strategies, so I appreciate you sharing your knowledge and your wisdom on that, Emily. And we will also be sending out a survey for everyone. The link is in our chat box, so if you would rather to just go in there and click on the link right now, it'll take you to the survey for today's session. We'd love to hear from you. It really helps us to know where we can improve, topics of interest, that sort of thing. And I think that's everything for us today, unless there's anyone else from the team that has something that I've maybe missed. Please feel free to jump in. If not, thank you so much for your time today. We've really appreciated you joining us, and we hope that you have a good rest of your day. Thanks, everybody.